Behind the famous image of youthful vigor and physical fitness stood a president battling an astonishing array of secret medical conditions, from receiving last rites 5 times before Dallas to taking mysterious amphetamine cocktails from a doctor nicknamed Dr. Feelgood. John F. Kennedy's true health story reads like medical fiction. His back brace may have cost him his life. Doctors injected him up to 6 times daily just to face the day, and he took more medications than any president in history, all while the public believed he was the picture of health. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about JFK's secret health problems. Fact 1. Given last rites 5 times before death. Most people know that President John F. Kennedy received last rites after being shot in Dallas in 1963. But what almost nobody realizes is that a Catholic priest had already performed this sacred ritual on him 4 different times before that fateful day. In the Catholic faith, last rites are administered when someone is believed to be dying, and the fact that Kennedy survived these encounters again and again makes his medical history even more remarkable. The first time happened when Kennedy was just 2 years old. On February 20th, 1920, the same day his mother Rose went into labor with his sister Kathleen, young Jack contracted scarlet fever at the family's home in Brookline, Massachusetts. The disease was potentially fatal for children at that time, and his condition became so serious that his family called a priest to his second-floor bedroom to deliver last rites before rushing him to Boston City Hospital. Against the odds, Kennedy survived after 6 weeks of treatment, followed by another 6 weeks in isolation at a hotel in Poland Spring, Maine. The second time came in 1947 when Kennedy was 30 years old and traveling in London. He became gravely ill during the trip, and when his condition deteriorated severely while crossing the Atlantic on his way home, a priest was summoned to perform last rites. His friend Pamela Churchill's doctor, Sir Daniel Davis, privately told her that Kennedy had Addison's disease and probably wouldn't live another year. Just 4 years later, in 1951, Kennedy was in Tokyo at the end of a long journey through Asia with his brother Robert when he suffered a severe Addison's disease crisis. His temperature spiked to an incredible 107 degrees Fahrenheit and he fell into a coma. Those around him were certain he couldn't possibly survive, and a priest was called in for the 3rd time. Robert Kennedy managed to get his brother transported to an American military hospital in Okinawa, where doctors saved his life once again. The 4th occasion happened in 1954 after Kennedy underwent risky spinal surgery as a U.S. Senator. He developed a urinary tract infection that became life-threatening due to his Addison's disease, causing his temperature to spike dangerously high and sending him into another coma. A priest administered last rites for what everyone thought would be the final time, and Kennedy's condition even sparked a Kennedy death watch on national television. But somehow, he pulled through after 5 months of recovery. Fact 2. Dr. Feelgood's amphetamine injections. One of the strangest aspects of Kennedy's medical care involved a German doctor named Max Jacobson, who became known by the Secret Service codename Dr. Feelgood. This physician administered injections that contained a dangerous mixture of methamphetamine, steroids, animal hormones, human placenta, enzymes, and vitamins, all brewed together in his unlicensed back-office laboratory. When patients asked what was in the shots, Jacobson would simply reply in his thick German accent, "You're feeling better, correct?" Then that is all you need to know. Kennedy first met Dr. Feelgood in September of 1960 through a photographer friend named Mark Shaw, just before the first televised presidential debate against Richard Nixon. The senator was exhausted from campaigning, his back pain was getting worse, and he was slurring his speech from fatigue. Jacobson injected his special mixture directly into Kennedy's throat to cure his laryngitis, and within minutes, Kennedy's voice returned at full strength. He went on to decisively win that debate, a turning point that many believe helped secure his victory in the election. When asked about the debate performance, Nixon himself commented that he had never seen Kennedy looking so healthy. Once Kennedy became president, Jacobson visited the White House more than 30 times in 1961 and 1962. The doctor even traveled with the president on Air Force One to important summit meetings in Paris and Vienna. Before Kennedy's critical meeting with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna, Jacobson gave the president an injection just before the afternoon session. When the meeting ran long and the effects began wearing off, Jacobson injected Kennedy 2 more times that same day. Some historians believe the amphetamines may have affected Kennedy's judgment during this disastrous summit, where Khrushchev dominated the discussions. Kennedy's own doctors were horrified by Jacobson's treatments. Dr. Eugene Cohen, who treated Kennedy for Addison's disease, wrote a direct warning to the president, stating that no responsible individual who might have to decide the fate of the universe at any moment should be taking such stimulating injections that condition one's needs almost like a narcotic. Another physician, Dr. Hans Kraus, was even more blunt, saying, "No president with his finger on the red button has any business taking stuff like that." Despite these warnings, Kennedy famously dismissed the concerns by saying, "I don't care if it's horse piss, it works." Fact 3. Taking 10 to 12 medications daily. When John F. Kennedy walked into the Oval Office each morning, he did so with a cocktail of 10 to 12 different medications already coursing through his system, making him perhaps the most medicated president in American history. The sheer scope of what Kennedy was taking on a daily basis wasn't revealed until 2002, when historian Robert Dallek gained access to JFK's sealed medical records at the Kennedy Presidential Library. And what he found left researchers stunned by the complexity and quantity of drugs the president required just to function. For pain management alone, Kennedy was taking a rotation of powerful narcotics, including codeine, Demerol, and methadone, which are opioids that today would raise serious concerns about dependency and cognitive effects in someone holding the nation's highest office. To help him stay alert and focused despite the sedating effects of his pain medications, he was prescribed Ritalin, a stimulant that works by increasing dopamine levels in the brain. His severe back spasms required muscle relaxants including phenobarbital, Librium, and meprobamate, while his inability to sleep through the pain meant he also needed barbiturates like Nembutal just to get a few hours of rest each night. Beyond the pain management, Kennedy's Addison's disease required daily oral cortisone and injected corticosteroids to replace the hormones his failing adrenal glands could no longer produce on their own. And without these steroids, he would have died within days. His hypothyroidism meant he took liothyronine, a thyroid hormone, 25 micrograms twice daily throughout his entire presidency. To combat the weight loss and muscle wasting caused by his chronic diarrhea and the side effects of steroids, doctors prescribed daily testosterone pills. His compromised immune system from the Addison's disease made him extremely susceptible to infections, so he regularly received injections of gamma globulin, a blood derivative that helps fight off bacterial and viral threats. On top of all this, Kennedy frequently needed multiple courses of antibiotics for recurring urinary tract infections, skin infections, and respiratory infections that his weakened immune system couldn't fight off naturally. Fact 4. 6 daily injections, just to function. Most people imagine a president taking a pill or two each day to manage health issues, but for John F. Kennedy, just getting through a single day in the White House required an extraordinary medical intervention that sounds more like emergency room treatment than routine care. Kennedy's personal physician would inject him with powerful local anesthetics up to 6 times per day in 6 different places on his back, simply to enable him to stand upright, walk, and perform his basic presidential duties without collapsing from pain. The White House physician administered these injections using Novocaine and Procaine, which are the same numbing agents dentists use during dental procedures, but Kennedy needed them injected directly into his back muscles and spine just to function. According to medical records that were sealed for decades after his death, these weren't occasional treatments during particularly bad flare-ups, but rather a daily routine that Kennedy endured throughout much of his presidency. The injections targeted specific pain points along his lower back and spine, with the doctor methodically working through 6 different injection sites to provide enough numbness for Kennedy to make it through meetings, public appearances, and the demanding schedule of leading the country. What makes this even more remarkable is that Kennedy received these injections on top of all the other medications he was taking, which included oral pain medications like codeine, Demerol, and methadone. The fact that he still needed 6 additional injections each day shows just how severe his back pain truly was. Dr. Jeffrey Kellman, who reviewed Kennedy's medical records, explained that these repeated injections were necessary just to enable the president to face the day, meaning that without this intensive treatment regimen, Kennedy would have been physically unable to perform even basic presidential functions. The injections weren't a cure or even a long-term treatment. They were essentially a daily patch job that allowed Kennedy to temporarily mask his pain long enough to appear in public and conduct the business of the presidency. White House staff and those close to Kennedy witnessed this painful ritual regularly, but the American public had no idea their vigorous young president was being injected like a pincushion just to walk across a room. Fact 5. Back brace may have caused death. On the morning of November the 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy went through a painful daily ritual in his hotel room in Fort Worth, Texas. His valet helped him put on a surgical corset designed to support his chronically damaged back, lacing it tightly around his torso. He then pulled a long elastic bandage over his feet, twisted it into a figure 8 shape, and slipped it up over both legs before adjusting it over his hips. This rigid back brace extended from below his waist all the way up past his chest, above his nipples, holding his spine completely upright and severely restricting any natural movement. Just a few hours later, when Lee Harvey Oswald's first bullet struck Kennedy in the back of the neck, it should have been survivable. The bullet passed cleanly through soft tissue, bruising a lung and ripping through his windpipe before exiting at his throat, but it missed his spine and all major blood vessels. When Texas Governor John Connally, sitting in front of Kennedy, was hit by that same bullet moments later, he immediately pivoted to his left and collapsed into his wife's lap. But frame-by-frame analysis of the Zapruder film shows Kennedy remained completely upright, his body held rigid by the tightly laced corset. Dr. Kenneth Salyer, the 27-year-old resident on duty at Parkland Hospital, was shocked when Kennedy's clothes were removed, and he discovered the heavy, corset-like brace underneath. Salyer and other medical experts believe that without this brace, the force of that first bullet traveling at 2,000 feet per second would have driven Kennedy's body forward, making him writhe in pain and likely causing him to slump down in the car seat out of view of Oswald's rifle scope. Instead, the brace kept him perfectly upright and almost motionless for approximately 5 more seconds, providing Oswald with what was essentially a stationary target. Warren Commission Assistant Counsel Arlen Specter later pointed out that the president's back brace kept him in an erect position so that the second bullet struck him in the head. The very device Kennedy relied on to function through daily life may have prevented him from surviving that tragic day in Dallas. Fact 6. Contracted Kennedy's medical records from his teenage years reveal something most people would never associate with America's youngest elected president. He contracted a sexually transmitted infection while still a teenager. According to childhood medical records reviewed by researchers Joan and Clay Blair, Kennedy came down with chlamydia during his youth, an infection that would have lasting consequences for his health throughout his entire life. This wasn't just a brief embarrassment that cleared up with treatment. The infection reportedly caused chronic prostatitis, which is an inflammation of the prostate gland, and recurring urinary tract infections that Kennedy dealt with for decades. Medical historians have noted that Kennedy's prostate problems and urinary issues were a constant source of discomfort, requiring frequent courses of antibiotics and treatment throughout his time in Congress, the Senate, and even during his presidency. What makes this particularly significant is that Kennedy was known for his extraordinary number of romantic encounters, and according to those close to him, he wasn't exactly careful about protection. One female acquaintance famously remarked that Kennedy was not much for planning ahead, a comment that takes on additional meaning when you consider his medical history. His close friend, Senator George Smathers, once observed that Kennedy had the most active libido of any man I have ever known, and a fellow congressman noted that traveling with him was like traveling with a bull. The teenage infection and its long-term effects added yet another layer to Kennedy's already complicated medical situation. While the public saw a vigorous young leader, doctors were quietly treating him for infections and inflammation that stemmed from decisions made in his youth. This condition required ongoing medical management, including regular doses of penicillin and other antibiotics, which only added to the already staggering number of medications Kennedy took on a daily basis throughout his political career. Fact 7. Swam twice daily, often naked. To manage his debilitating back pain, President Kennedy made swimming a core part of his daily routine at the White House, using the heated indoor pool that had originally been installed for Franklin D. Roosevelt's polio therapy back in 1933. Kennedy would stop by the pool around noon, strip down completely for a swim, and then walk back to his bedroom wearing nothing but a robe for lunch and an afternoon nap. He repeated this exact same routine at the end of each workday, changing into yet another fresh suit for dinner, which meant that Chief Usher J.B. West observed that John F. Kennedy wore 3 completely separate suits of clothes every single day of his White House life. The pool became more than just a place for physical therapy. It turned into a social hub where Kennedy would invite cabinet members to join him for swimming races, creating an unusual mix of political discussion and athletic competition. What made these gatherings particularly unconventional was that Kennedy had absolutely no qualms about swimming in the nude and regularly invited others to participate in the same way, including staff members and even ambassadors. Lyndon Johnson, who would later become president himself, continued this tradition and once famously invited the evangelical minister Billy Graham to join him for a naked swim in the same pool. Kennedy's father commissioned an elaborate Caribbean-themed mural to be painted on 3 of the pool's walls in 1961, transforming the space into what some described as having a lurid tropical atmosphere. The president used the pool so frequently that it became one of his favorite places in the entire White House complex. And swimming was one of the few physical activities that actually provided him relief from the constant pain that radiated through his lower back and spine. His exercise regimen in the pool, combined with weightlifting 3 times per week under the guidance of Dr. Hans Kraus, eventually led to dramatic improvements in his condition by the summer of 1962, making the pool an essential part of managing his numerous health problems. Fact 8. Most complex medical history ever. When medical historian Dr. Lee R. Mandel reviewed John F. Kennedy's complete health records in 2009, he made a startling conclusion that JFK had the most complex medical history of anyone to occupy the White House. This wasn't just about having a bad back or a single chronic condition, it was about juggling an entire collection of serious interconnected diseases that would have left most people bedridden or disabled. Kennedy was essentially managing what doctors now believe was autoimmune polyglandular syndrome type 2, a rare genetic disorder that caused his immune system to attack multiple organs in his body at the same time. The list of confirmed diagnoses reads like a medical textbook. Kennedy suffered from Addison's disease, which meant his adrenal glands had essentially shriveled up and stopped producing the vital hormones needed to regulate blood pressure, blood sugar, and the body's response to stress. Without daily steroid injections, he would have died. He also had hypothyroidism, meaning his thyroid gland wasn't producing enough hormones either, which required him to take thyroid medication twice daily throughout his entire presidency. His chronic spastic colitis caused severe abdominal cramping and diarrhea that restricted him to bland diets and required multiple antispasmodic medications. The osteoporosis in his spine was so severe that his lower vertebrae were literally crumbling, riddled with compression fractures that caused excruciating pain. He also dealt with recurring prostatitis and urinary tract infections that needed frequent courses of antibiotics. What made Kennedy's case even more remarkable was that all these conditions were likely connected through autoimmune polyglandular syndrome type 2, a disorder where the body's immune system systematically attacks its own endocrine glands. Doctors estimate this syndrome affects only about 1 in 20,000 people. The fact that Kennedy not only survived with this constellation of diseases, but also managed to project an image of youth and vigor while running the country during some of the Cold War's most dangerous moments, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, is what made his medical history truly unprecedented in presidential history. Fact 9. Mysterious 15-pound weight gain. Throughout his entire adult life, John F. Kennedy had always been exceptionally thin, struggling to maintain even a modest weight on his 6-foot frame. From the time he was 20 years old until he reached 43, his weight remained remarkably consistent at around 155 to 160 pounds, giving him a lean, almost gaunt appearance that some people compared to Abraham Lincoln. He consumed massive amounts of ice cream during college and worked hard at gaining weight, but his body simply wouldn't add bulk, likely due to his chronic digestive issues and Addison's disease that plagued him throughout his life. Then something strange happened during the 1960 presidential campaign. Between July of 1960 and January of 1961, Kennedy suddenly gained between 15 and 20 pounds in just 6 months, a dramatic change for someone whose weight had barely fluctuated in over 2 decades. His longtime friend Lem Billings noticed the transformation immediately, pointing out that if you compared photographs of Kennedy from July of 1960 with pictures taken in January of 1961, he looked noticeably heavier and his entire appearance had changed. The weight gain was significant enough that even Kennedy's own mother, Rose Kennedy, made note of it in her diary on November 3, 1960. She wrote that Jack looks unusually well and commented that his cheeks have filled out amazingly since she had seen him back in June. She added a telling observation, noting that he had lost that lean Lincoln-esque look, which she secretly liked better, suggesting she preferred his naturally thin appearance to this new, heavier version of her son. Medical experts who later examined Kennedy's records believe the sudden weight gain was almost certainly caused by his steroid treatments for Addison's disease. Long-term use of corticosteroids is well known to cause weight gain and a condition called moon face, where the face becomes rounder and fuller. Kennedy was taking testosterone during this period as well, which his doctors had prescribed to help him gain weight and stimulate his appetite, since his chronic diarrhea and intestinal problems constantly caused him to lose weight. His personal physician, Dr. Janet Travel, took a photograph of President-elect Kennedy on November 15, 1960, showing him bare-chested and leaping to catch a football, where he appeared trim, muscular, and well-proportioned, a stark contrast to his previous skeletal appearance. Fact 10. Could not bend to tie shoes. One of the most telling signs of just how severe President Kennedy's back problems really were came down to something most of us do every single morning without even thinking about it. John F. Kennedy could not physically bend over to tie his own shoes. His back pain was so intense and his spine had become so rigid from years of arthritis and osteoporosis that this simple everyday task was completely impossible for him to perform on his own. The president's valet had to help him get dressed each morning, assisting with his socks and shoes because Kennedy simply couldn't reach his own feet. Medical records and accounts from those close to him reveal that he couldn't even put on his left sock without help. His lower back and the joints connecting his spine to his pelvis were so stiff and painful that any forward bending motion was beyond his physical capability. The pain would shoot through his body if he tried, and the mechanical limitation of his deteriorated spine meant that even if he could tolerate the agony, his body just wouldn't bend that way anymore. This wasn't something that happened overnight. Kennedy's spine had been progressively deteriorating for years, with X-rays showing that his lower vertebrae were riddled with compression fractures. The bones had become so weakened by osteoporosis that doctors later described them as having turned to mush. Every day he wore a rigid back brace that went from his chest all the way down below his waist, wrapped tightly with elastic bandages in a figure-8 pattern, just to keep him upright and somewhat mobile throughout the day. White House staff and those who worked closely with the president witnessed this reality daily, though the American public never knew about it. While Kennedy projected an image of youth, vigor, and athletic ability to the nation, behind closed doors he needed assistance with basic personal tasks that most people accomplish without a second thought. The man who inspired Americans to be more physically active couldn't even tie his own shoelaces. Fact 11. Spent half his life in pain. John F. Kennedy lived with constant, debilitating pain for most of his adult life, but he was so skilled at hiding it that even people who worked closely with him every single day had no idea how much he was suffering. After the president's assassination, his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, reflected on just how severe John's pain had been throughout his entire life. Robert stated that at least one half of the days that he spent on this earth were days of intense physical pain, which means that for roughly half of every single year, Kennedy was dealing with levels of discomfort that would have left most people unable to function at all. What makes this even more remarkable is what Robert said next, noting, "I never heard him complain. I never heard him say anything that would indicate that he felt God had dealt with him unjustly." Kennedy's ability to mask his suffering was so complete that only his closest friends and family members could tell when he was having a particularly bad day. Robert explained that people who knew the president well would recognize the signs, observing that his face was a little whiter, the lines around his eyes were a little deeper, his words a little sharper. But anyone who didn't know him intimately detected nothing at all. This meant that during important meetings, public appearances, and even critical moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was often in excruciating pain while maintaining a completely calm and collected exterior that projected strength and confidence. Almost every single day of his adult life, Kennedy experienced severe back pain, especially in his lumbar spine and sacroiliac joints, and his back was frequently so stiff from pain and arthritis that he couldn't perform simple tasks like bending over. Despite spending hours each day managing his pain through medications, injections, swimming, and wearing restrictive back braces, he never let the public see his struggle. His stoic endurance of this daily torture while running the country and projecting an image of youthful vigor remains one of the most extraordinary acts of willpower in presidential history. Fact 12. Lower vertebrae turned to mush. When historian Robert Dallek was granted access to John F. Kennedy's sealed medical records in 2002, he discovered X-rays that revealed a shocking truth about the president's spine. The images showed that Kennedy's lower vertebrae had deteriorated to such an extreme degree that doctors described them as having turned to mush. The bone structure that should have been solid and supportive had become riddled with compression fractures and severe osteoporosis, creating a spinal column that was barely holding itself together. The damage was so extensive that medical experts who reviewed the records were stunned Kennedy could even walk, let alone maintain the active public image he projected to the American people. His lumbar spine and sacroiliac joints were particularly affected, with the vertebrae showing signs of advanced degeneration that would typically be seen in someone decades older or someone who had experienced severe trauma. The compression fractures meant that the vertebrae were literally collapsing in on themselves, creating constant pressure on nerves and making every movement excruciating. What made this discovery even more significant was the likely cause of such catastrophic bone deterioration. Medical historians believe that Kennedy's osteoporosis was directly linked to the steroid treatments he had been receiving since his teenage years, possibly beginning as early as 1937 when doctors started treating his chronic colitis with corticosteroids. At that time, the long-term effects of steroid use were not well understood and dosing was imprecise. Doctors had no idea that these medications, while helping manage his digestive issues, were simultaneously destroying the structural integrity of his bones. The steroids Kennedy took for decades to treat his various conditions, including Addison's disease, had a devastating cumulative effect on his skeletal system. By the time he reached the White House at age 43, his spine had the bone density and structural stability of someone much older and far more fragile, creating the foundation for the chronic, debilitating pain that would plague him throughout his presidency. Fact 13. Father's influence got him into Navy. When John F. Kennedy tried to enlist in the military to serve his country during World War II, his body had other plans. Both the United States Army and the Navy initially rejected him because his medical records painted the picture of someone who had no business being anywhere near active military service. Kennedy's lifelong health problems, including his chronic back pain, gastrointestinal issues, and general physical frailty, made him an obvious liability on paper. For most young men in his condition, that rejection would have been the end of the story. But Kennedy wasn't most young men. He had a powerful father who knew how to make things happen. Joseph Kennedy Sr., a wealthy businessman and former ambassador to Great Britain, wasn't about to let something as inconvenient as his son's failing health stand in the way of military service. Using his extensive political connections and influence, Joe Sr. pulled the necessary strings to get John into the Naval Reserve, effectively overriding the medical concerns that had initially disqualified him. But the elder Kennedy's intervention didn't stop there. According to historical records, John Kennedy likely joined the Navy without undergoing a proper physical examination, or at the very least, he withheld critical medical information from military doctors during whatever limited examination he did receive. When Kennedy finally got his assignment to PT boat training in the South Pacific, he lucked into another break that had nothing to do with his abilities. The Navy was so desperate for volunteers to man these dangerous patrol torpedo boats that they failed to scrutinize candidates very carefully. In fact, the PT boat training program was one of the very few that did not require a full physical examination at all. Kennedy's executive officer on PT 109, Lenny Tom, later wrote letters home, describing how Kennedy constantly wore a corset-type back brace and kept a plywood board under his mattress, yet refused to report to sickbay because he knew it would end his service. Kennedy essentially concealed his condition from his crew and commanding officers, pretending to be well, even though his body was barely holding together. Fact 14. Used pool as sexual headquarters. Behind the carefully crafted image of presidential dignity, the White House swimming pool became something far different from a simple exercise facility during John F. Kennedy's time in office. According to multiple Secret Service agents who were stationed at the White House and staff members who worked there, Kennedy regularly used the heated indoor pool for private encounters with two young secretaries from his staff, women who became known throughout the White House by the nicknames Fiddle and Faddle. The two secretaries, whose real names were Priscilla Ware and Jill Cowan, worked in the press office and would frequently leave their desks during Kennedy's scheduled swimming sessions, which often happened around lunchtime. The pattern became so routine that other White House staff members would notice the women returning to their workstations with noticeably wet hair, a detail that made it clear they had been swimming rather than simply keeping the President company poolside. The pool itself had been renovated with Kennedy family money, with his father, Joseph Kennedy, commissioning a Caribbean-themed mural painted on 3 of the walls surrounding the water, creating what some described as an almost tropical atmosphere in the middle of the West Wing. The swimming pool sessions weren't limited to just these two staff members. Mimi Alford, a White House intern who later wrote a memoir about her relationship with Kennedy titled Once Upon a Secret, described the pool as being at the center of the president's private life at the White House. She recounted how these gatherings would happen with remarkable frequency, sometimes while the First Lady was traveling or occupied with other duties. The heated pool, which was located between the White House residence and the West Wing, offered both privacy and convenience, making it an ideal location that was away from the more public areas of the executive mansion. What makes this particularly notable is that Kennedy maintained his image as a devoted family man and attentive president throughout this period, with the public having absolutely no knowledge of these activities until decades after his death, when former staff members and Secret Service agents finally began speaking about what they had witnessed during the Kennedy administration. Fact 15. Political cover-up used careful wording. When Lyndon Johnson's campaign team started spreading rumors about Kennedy's Addison's disease during the 1960 Democratic presidential nomination battle, the Kennedy camp knew they had a serious problem on their hands. If the American public learned that their young, vigorous candidate suffered from a potentially life-threatening adrenal condition, his chances of winning the White House would likely evaporate. So Bobby Kennedy, serving as his brother's campaign manager and chief protector, crafted what medical historians now consider one of the most brilliant political deceptions in American history. The statement Bobby released was a masterpiece of carefully chosen words. It claimed that John Kennedy does not now, nor has he ever had an ailment described classically as Addison's disease, which is a tuberculous destruction of the adrenal gland. At first glance, this appears to be a flat denial, and that's exactly how most people interpreted it at the time. But here's the clever part. Bobby wasn't actually lying. The statement was technically accurate because it hinged on the word classically. In the 1940s and 50s, when doctors used the term classical Addison's disease, they were specifically referring to cases caused by tuberculosis, which accounted for only about 10% of all Addison's diagnoses. John Kennedy's Addison's disease was caused by an autoimmune condition, not tuberculosis, which meant Bobby could truthfully say his brother didn't have the classical form of the disease. The statement was so skillfully worded that it fooled almost everyone. Journalists and political opponents didn't catch the subtle distinction between having Addison's disease and having the tuberculosis-caused version of Addison's disease. Navy physician Dr. Lee Mandel, who later studied Kennedy's medical records, called this denial undoubtedly one of the most cleverly laid smokescreens ever put down around a politician. The deception worked perfectly, allowing Kennedy to continue portraying himself as healthy and vigorous while secretly managing a serious chronic condition that required daily steroid injections just to keep him alive.